All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our presentation of Chart of Accounts Restructuring, Best Practices when your chart of accounts is changing. A few quick notes as we get going. Today's event is being recorded for future viewing, and we can send a copy of these slides to anyone after the event. During the presentation, all attendees will be muted. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A section. We'll try and answer them as we go along, but if we don't, we can certainly answer them afterwards. Well, we know that some of you are here on this call out of curiosity, and some are here just for general education, and some are here because you have a specific initiative in this area. Either way, we'd appreciate you taking just 15 minutes with us over the next week or so for a chat. So in the next day or so, myself or one of my colleagues will be reaching out to you with a 15-minute invite. We hope to get your feedback, and we hope to have a brief conversation about this. To give you a little background on myself, my name is Lee Lazaro. I am the Planning Analytics Practice Leader at Revelwood. In summary, what the right side of this slide shows is I've been doing this for a long time. From the TM1 side, from the Planning Analytics side, I am a certified developer. I have been involved in taking and in some cases creating the Planning Analytics certification tests. From an educational standpoint, my undergraduate degree, my master's degree, we're all focused on some form of business aspect. And as the last bullet says, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing this for over 25 years of various forms of accounting and implementation experience. So there's a lot that we're working on, and there's a lot that I've seen. During the course of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about a series of things. Our agenda is that we're going to start by telling you a little bit about Revelwood, for those of you who don't know us. We'll talk a little bit about why we would have chart of account changes. The majority of today's presentation is going to be about things that we want to take into consideration. And this is where we're going to discuss everything associated with the chart of accounts. We're going to talk on the business side. We're going to talk on the user side. We're going to talk on the technical side. And then after we talk about a lot of different things to consider and a lot of different things in theory, we're going to go through some real life examples that we have of some of our clients. And then we'll wrap things up with some next steps and things to take into consideration. So let me start by explaining a little bit about who we are and why you're here to listen to us. Revelwood is an award-winning IBM business analytics partner. We have been doing this for a long time, and we have won a series of awards. Over to the right, you can see that we are one of their gold business partners, which is the highest level that IBM has. Over the past 25 years, we have won a series of awards, and in most situations, whether it was some form of certification or it was some form of award, Revelwood was the very first person to win it. We were the very first person to win what they call, or to achieve what they call gold status, which was the standard of doing the implementations, and we have received a series of awards of doing that. Mostly because we solve business solutions. We don't just implement technical solutions. At the very bottom of the slide, you can see we speak business first. Our main goal is to solve business solutions, which is why we're talking about chart of accounts today. Recently, we were announced as one of only a few companies from across the entire world that was selected for an advisory board. And that advisory board brings us all together. We look into aspects associated with the tool. We look into aspects associated with the roadmap. We look into aspects associated with the business decisions coming into play. So in addition to having a lot of experience, we're also very involved in helping IBM move forward and helping our clients move forward in terms of solving their business problems. So let's talk a little bit about what we're here for. We're here about the chart of accounts. And then let's start by thinking about it of why would we want to change the chart of accounts? So probably the main reason for some kind of a chart of account change is usually associated with an acquisition or merger. And this is not necessarily something where you're purposely trying to redesign, but what you're trying to do instead is to create a combined chart of accounts. Maybe you have a situation where your two organizations are merging together and there's no commonality, so we need to build that commonality. Maybe there's situations where we need to make sure that everybody's speaking the same language. Now, what does that mean, speaking the same language? If we're talking about the phrase business unit, if we're talking about the phrase line of business, we want to create some kind of commonality. And that's probably the biggest reason why organizations change their chart of accounts. There's other things that come into consideration when you do that. For example, maybe you're now talking about impacts of currency or impacts of other aspects. And we'll talk about that in another presentation, but for purposes of today, we'll focus mostly just on the chart of accounts. Okay? Now, while most of our chart of account changes come into play because of some kind of acquisition, another reason why it happens a lot is because an organization is moving to some kind of a new ERP or some kind of a new general ledger system. Okay? We know that one of the reasons you move to an ERP is because it's got some great new features. And as part of those new features, changing your chart of account structure is designed to take advantage of that full functionality. This also impacts some of the data entry, some of the ability for us to enter data. Maybe we're not planning at a GL account level anymore. Maybe we're planning at a line item detail. Maybe we're switching our input approach from a top down to a bottoms up. Maybe we're changing some kind of a mechanism so that when we do long-term planning, instead of doing it by quarter, maybe we're doing it by month. Maybe we're even bringing it down to the week. Utilizing those new features gives us the ability to make the most of our ERP, and many times that ERP requires changes to the chart of accounts. It also gives us the ability to introduce new processes, new modules associated with it. In Oracle, maybe we're creating some kind of a projects model where we can have detailed tracking by specific project element. Maybe we're putting in a human capital management, an HCM model, where we're doing some kind of a tracking by person. All of these pieces give us the ability to do things at a deeper and more granular level, but also potentially add the requirement of adding some new change or making some changes to the chart of accounts. But we also might make some changes to it because maybe it didn't merge. Maybe you just used up what was originally built and you can't efficiently generate reports. Maybe you ran out of numbering codes. When you initially created your chart of accounts, maybe you used 2 digits and now you realize that you have more accounts that you need. Maybe you use 3 digits and then when you're trying to put sub accounts and other pieces in, you realize you needed a 4th. So maybe you've run out of those numbering codes and maybe they no longer fit into your predefined ranges. Maybe if you use 3 digits and it turns out that you have 105 sub accounts, that what you did is you said, let me take the new ones and I'll just put it under another account. And maybe those predefined ranges have filled up. Okay? Those first 2 pieces can lead into the last one. And really what it is it's just force fitting. In many situations, we recreate the chart of accounts because we want that similar meaning. What we said earlier on the previous slide is we want everybody to speak the same language. We want to make sure that same segments have the same meanings. We don't want to force something and make it fit. Okay? And sometimes it's about efficiently generating the reports, but sometimes you can't even do it. Sometimes you can't support the reporting requirements internally. Maybe there's a new line of business or a new business unit, or maybe and that aspect never came into consideration before. Maybe you need to do some more detailed tracking. Instead of just looking at your marketing costs, maybe you want to do specific tracking in regards to how am I spending it and what am I doing online? What am I doing with print media, things like that. Maybe it's not an issue of reporting internally. Maybe it's more of an external. This is where the rules and regulations come into play. One of the manufacturing clients that we're working with right now has to do external compliance reporting to 3 different entities. And those 3 different entities span between federal and state. And at the federal level, they actually span between multiple countries. I promise you that when you're talking federal and state, and definitely country versus country, the reporting requirements are different and they're regularly changing. So that approach gives us sometimes the requirement to change our chart of accounts. So there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different reasons why you're changing your chart of accounts. And now we need to think a little bit about how do we change this? What are the types of charts of account changes? So maybe you're changing your segmentation. And when I say segmentation, this is where we think together. In the TM1 world, we're talking dimensionality, but in the GL, we're talking 123-45-67, where maybe 123 is our natural account, 45 is our company, 67 is our department. Within those segments, maybe you need to change them. Maybe you're adding more segments. And if you're adding more segments, sometimes it's a one-to-many. I'm taking my numbers, I'm splitting it off somehow. Sometimes it's a many-to-many, and I need to figure out the links and how do I combine those together. One-to-many is definitely the most complicated. You have to think about the ratios of the split. If I have $100 in a situation and now they're going to 2 accounts, how do I split it? Do I do 50-50? Do I do 70-30? What's the ratio? And because of the fact that there's that approach, it's kind of hard to reconcile, because there's the concept of I have to build subtotals and I have to be able to map back and forth. And putting those two pieces together, figuring out how to split and figuring out how to put it back together, definitely adds a lot of complexity. So one-to-many is definitely the most complicated. It's very doable. It is something that we've done at other clients, and when we get into some of the examples, we'll talk a little bit about it, but it's complicated if there's a lot of one-to-manys. Now, maybe you're doing the exact opposite. Maybe instead of making more segments, maybe you have situations where you have segments that you didn't use. We have a few clients who, when they originally built a chart of accounts, they built some segments in there, which they use for some kind of a future use, or maybe they use it where they say, we think we're going to need it later. And it turns out that 5-10 years later, they have one element in there, which is just a series of zeros. In those particular cases, maybe in the new world, it's determined, let me make it less segments. And in that case, what we're going to do is we're just going to take a many to one. We're either going to remove something or we're going to do some kind of a mapping where we merge it together. Now, that's definitely a lot easier to do when it comes time to do our chart of account change. But as you can expect, there's a lot less granularity in the new world. So segmentation is one of the types of change in regards to how we make those changes. The other type of change typically comes into play of changing the elements itself. So remember that a full dimensional restructure is not the only way to redesign. It could just become a rebuild of your same structure. And that's where you may want to make some changes, maybe the number of characters. One of the examples I used before is maybe you use 3 characters in your GL natural accounts, and now you need to do 4. Maybe there's new elements in there. If you've done an acquisition or if you've done a merge, you definitely have new companies, new business units, new cost centers. Maybe there's new definitions for those existing codes. And if you think about it, in situations where there's not a common chart of account, the approach of having some additional definitions is new for someone else. If my organization uses business units 1, 2, and 3, and I merge with an organization that uses 4, 5, and 6, there's really not new codes. But to me, 4, 5, and 6 are new. So it's something where when I'm creating that chart of account change and when I'm looking at some of those new pieces, it's new for somebody. But remember, there's more to think about than just the account structure, because the ERP implementation team, they own the remapping. And the ERP implementation team is in charge of what they're in charge of. They're in charge of the GL. They're in charge of the account structure. They're in charge of aspects associated with the general ledger. But you, every person listening on this call, you own reporting. And there's more to consider than just the GL balances. Okay? You want to think through your subsystems. This is where maybe in your TM1 model or maybe in your existing model, you've got an AP system or an AR system, and you're pulling in data. Maybe you're going to have something in there where you've got those subsystems in TM1 or planning analytics, but you don't have those as part of the ERP implementation. Maybe you've got other systems that are going to be feeding it in. You've got external billings. You've got inventory. We have a client who asked us to create an export that'd be used for an invoicing system. All of these things are part of their TM1 models, but they're not part of the ERP system. So it's something that we still need to consider. Okay? Any situation where we've got detailed information, employee data, sales by product, sales by customer. We've got all the different KPIs that come into play where they're not necessarily done in the ERP, but they are still done in the reporting system. We have a client who asked us to create a production planning model. And what they wanted us to do is they wanted us to use their staffing. They wanted us to use their sales. They wanted us to merge that all together. And they wanted to be able to create work schedules out of it. Definitely not something associated with the general ledger, but definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration as you're updating your structures. Okay? And we also want to consider the aspects associated with the lists. So what we want to think of is we want to think of the elements. We want to think of, using TM1 terminology, the elements within the dimensions. Customer codes, product codes, employee IDs, asset numbers, anything that is associated with a granularity and anything that's associated with the data that you have in your model, that again is not necessarily part of the GL. Okay? And this is where you want to think of creating some master lists. Your ERP team is creating a master chart of account. This is where you want to think about taking those aspects, your customer codes and your asset numbers, and creating some kind of a master list to ensure, I'm going to pause for dramatic effect in a moment, consistency. That's probably the biggest goal of this. I've said it twice now, and I'm going to say it a third time, is you all want to speak the same language. We want to make sure that we have consistency. You want to use the same code numbers. You want to use the same descriptions. You want to use the same attributes. And you want to use the same terminology for it. You don't want to have one situation where somebody's calling it a cost center and another person is calling it LOB. Or you don't want to have some kind of situation where Johnny's calling it A, but then people in the other department call it B. You want to make sure that as the team is communicating, not only are you looking at the same pieces, but you're talking about it in the same way. So once we've got these pieces together, now what we want to think is we want to think about the data that's coming into play as part of this. Okay? It's easily forgotten. It's easily forgotten to think about history, and it's not always important. Sometimes it's forgotten on purpose. It's not always important to the ERP team to think about your historical data. Why? A lot of clients, a lot of projects, you're only going to remap 1 or 2 years of history. Why? Because there's a lot of data. And based on the fact that there's a lot of data to be remapped, then sometimes the ERP implementation team, whether it's associated with a business reason, maybe it's associated with timing, maybe it's associated with the overall budget and the scope of the project. But many of these projects only remap a little bit of history. However, your system most likely has more data than that. So the thing to think about is how much do you want to remap? Okay, this is going to impact a few different things. Trend reporting. You want to think about trend reporting, seasonal planning. You want to ensure that you're putting in enough data to make sure that a few exception years don't skew the overall results. Right now is a perfect example of that in the real world. I could go back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years and see some kind of a consistent trend. But in 2020, COVID happened. And COVID absolutely skewed the results. So if I were in an ERP implementation right now and I was remapping last year and this year, my numbers, I'm pretty sure, would be skewed in some form. Even to this extent that I would say they're way out of whack. You definitely want to make sure that you're going to not impact your seasonal planning. You also want to think about budgeting. If you're using multiple years as a reference, some of our clients, when they do their budget, they look at current year forecast and last year's actual, and they say, that's enough that I know what's going on next year. But many of our clients like to use 2 years of actual. Some of our clients even go back 3 years of actual. If it turns out that it's going to impact how you do your planning and how you do your budgeting, you definitely want to make sure that you have a historical data. And if it turns out that you're going to use that historical data to pre-populate next year, one of our clients takes the average of the last 3 years and they use those averages to pre-populate next year. Well, if I'm only doing 2 years of historical mapping, but I need 3 years of averages, I can't do my budget. So you also want to think through the definitions, because that historical data might include some data points that the ERP team is not creating. What does that mean? It means that I might have 100 different accounts as part of what I've been using for the last 2 years, but maybe there was an account 3 years ago that I stopped using. Well, in the ERP team, they are potentially going to tell you that you have 100 elements in your account dimension. Here's how I map to it. And then as soon as I do my 3rd year, team 1 is going to say, wait a second, I don't know what this new account is or this old account. You want to think through the fact that if you end up doing a little bit more than what was handed to you, you may have to expand the scope a little bit. You may have to create or recreate some of those old pieces. Okay. And then you want to think about also, with those data points, how are we going to handle it? What are we going to do with that old data? Is that old data only going to be in the new system? Is it only going to be in TM1 or Planning Analytics? Or is it going to be in both the systems? We have had examples where we've been working on a project and determined, you know what, it makes sense to go back more than 2 years. It makes sense to go back 5 years. I think I'm going to ask the ERP team to expand their scope because I need it. We have also had situations where the organization does need to go back the extra years, and they said, you know what, we'll do the mapping ourselves. So another thing to think about when you're looking at that historical data is, where do you want to store it? Now, where do we want to restore it? we're talking about the data itself, the results, but we also want to think about the mapping. Okay, so we want to think through, how is that mapping going to happen? Because the basic approach of remapping, I need to have old data, I need to have a mapping definition, I need to bring it into the new data. So we just talked about, where is that data, where's the end results going to be stored? But we also want to think about the remapping. So the question is, do I do the remapping by putting it into planning analytics in TM1? Or do I do it back in the new source system? Okay. Really what this comes down to is, you want to think through, you want to think through, where is my data going to be mapped? And that's really where you're going to store it. There might be a combination. It really comes down to, where is all the data going to be? And if all the data is going to be mapped and massaged outside of TM1, create the mapping tables outside TM1. But if any of the data needs to be massaged or manipulated inside TM1, we have to have those mapping tables. So what that means is, really, storage is your big factor. Okay, what do we need to store? We need to store our mapping tables. We need to store the pre-map data. We need to store the post-map data. Okay, where do we want to store it? Do you want that pre-map data to stay in TM1? If so, how do you want to do it? Do you want to potentially have separate cubes on your same server? Well, if you want separate cubes, we need to have separate sets of naming conventions. This comes into play, as you know, TM1. The great thing about TM1 and planning analytics is, create once, use repeatedly. But it also comes at a cost. In order to create once, use repeatedly, that one definition has to mean the same thing across the board. So that comes into play for cubes. It comes into play for dimensions. It might even come into play for processes. You have to think through, how do we want those naming conventions to be saved into the server if it turns out we're going to use the same server? So what some organizations do is, instead of having one server with two sets of cubes, they'll create two separate servers. And this also leads to some other things to think about. Where do you want those servers? Do you want them on the same machine, or do you want them on different machines? You want to make sure that whatever you choose to do, you want to make sure that these two servers can communicate with each other. If we have historical data, and if you need to reconcile or do some reports, or maybe even do exports, imports, you have to make sure that those two machines, those two servers, however you choose to do it, can communicate with each other. So that comes into play with where we're going to store a lot of the remapping. But now we think about, how do we create those mapping tables? So thinking about those mapping tables itself is, if you're going to choose to create the mapping tables in your planning analytics environment, you want to start by thinking of, what's the type? Do we want a cube versus an attribute? Now, we typically recommend using a cube. Why? An attribute is designed to be a two-dimensional mapping. It's great because it's easy. It's great because you don't create a cube. It's great because it's two-dimensional. Potentially, it's not great because it's two-dimensional. So we typically recommend using a cube, because not only does it give the flexibility of having more than two dimensions in certain cases, but they're easily identifiable. It's going to be real easy for you to create some kind of a cube name, some kind of a prefix, some kind of a nomenclature that is easily identifiable, and it's easy to remove after the project is done. The recommendation that we have is, use a consistent approach. Whatever you choose to do, whether you're going with cubes or attributes, use a consistent approach. Don't use some cubes and some attributes. Why? Cleanup. You always say during a project, I'll take care of this later, I'll clean it up later, I'll get rid of stuff later. And everybody here knows later never comes. Be consistent. The more consistency you have, not only is it easier to use while you need it, it's easier to clean up when you don't need it. Okay? How do we populate those mapping tables? Load the definitions directly from ERP. So we don't want to try to replicate any rules. We don't want to try to build all the exceptions. We don't want to try to do all of the but situations that come into play. Okay? The way that I like to think about this is, think about your mapping table. If your mapping table is something that I can copy and paste, then I always recommend, actually, let me change that. If it's something that you can easily copy paste, I recommend that there's no right answer. It's absolutely something that we can copy paste into the TM1 environment. It's absolutely something that we can copy paste and keep it in the ERP environment. But in situations where there's a lot of exceptions, if there's a complicated mapping or there's a whole bunch of rules or something where it's not always the case, and maybe I need to think through some of the percentages or the values or the data point, in that particular case, I typically try to push back and say, let the ERP do it. You're recreating the wheel. There's no point in recreating the wheel if your mapping is complex. Okay? Why? Assume there's going to be a lot of iterations. Okay, and I'm stressing the word lot. You're potentially going to go right down to the final go live, right down to the final minute of your source system. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that it's easy to use and that it becomes somewhat routine and redundant. Okay, why? If you know that there's going to be a lot of iterations, I don't want to have to spend a lot of time rerunning the remapping. I want to be able to do something which makes it routine. I want to just be able to click on a couple of buttons and have it happen for me. I want it to be redundant. I don't want to have to put my effort in thinking about how am I going to remap this. I want that part to be very mundane so that I can then focus on the reconciliation. It's very important to think about. Do not belittle the time and effort to reconcile your data. Okay? This is a big effort. I like to think of this as the 80-20 rule. Okay? 80% of your time is going to go towards 20%. Most of your numbers are going to get mapped pretty quick. It's that last 20%, or depending on how things go, maybe it's that last 10% or even that 1%. The majority of your time is going to be focused on the minutia. Don't belittle the time and effort to reconcile that data. Okay? So start doing that remapping and the reconciliation as soon as possible. Okay? A lot of reasons, a lot of positives about that. For starters, it lets your subject matter experts see the data and sign off on the data. Okay? And as they're looking at the data, they're able to see it using the new chart. It gives your users the ability to start thinking using the new nomenclature. It gives your users the ability to start building reports using the new chart. And if they haven't been trained on the tool or they don't have the time to do the reports, a short-term approach can be views. Let them create views. But either way, they're starting to think in the new chart as opposed to the old chart. Many clients don't see the issues until they physically see the data in the new chart. And in that particular case, it moves from theory into reality. And that's why starting that remapping as soon as possible gives you a lot of different wins. Okay? And now we can think about how do we want to do that reconciliation. And this is where we're talking about that automated process. Revelwood recommends doing this via a three-step approach. Step number one, reload the mapping definitions. Whenever possible, make this some kind of an automated process. And as part of that automated process, we absolutely encourage you to do a full clear of the existing definitions and a replace. Okay? It's not efficient for you to manually go back and look at things one at a time. There's a million reasons why. Largest reasons of fat fingering or forgetting, the two bad Fs. Based on that, you don't want people to manually go back and have to change their definitions. You definitely want to automate that, and you definitely want to make sure that I'm doing a full reset. Why? We had talked before about the fact that maybe there's some new accounts that got added, or in some cases, maybe there's going to be accounts that get removed. We want to make sure that we're clearing out the remapping so we're not doubling up some of our numbers later. And the more automated you can make that, the easier it is for me to click on a button, grab a cup of coffee, and say I'm done. Part two, rerun that mapping process. That's what we just talked about, is I want to be able to click on that button. But the question you think about is, how often do I want to do it? Is it something where you want to do it on demand? Is it something where you want it to be scheduled on demand? It's great because it doesn't manipulate what you're in the midst of doing. It's great because you know that a change just came through. Let me click on the button, and hopefully over the course of a few seconds or a few minutes, you've got new numbers. Okay? Scheduled. If you know your numbers are changing, if you know that the ERP team is loading new mappings every night, why not have the process run as a chore every night? Think through what makes the most business sense. But again, the first two parts of that, click on a button to reload the mapping, click on a button to rerun the mapping. Maybe you create some kind of a linked TI process or a chore that does both of them with a single click. Okay? And then once your mapping is in there, part three that we recommend, reconcile your data. But don't recreate the wheel every time. Okay? We talked a little bit earlier in this slide about building some reports or using those views. Save them. Save those views, save those reconciliation reports. Give your users the ability so that after you've clicked on the button to do 1 and 2, maybe they just open up a view, whether it's a view, whether it's an Excel report and they do a Shift F9, maybe it's a PAW report where the numbers refresh automatically in it. However you set it up, have the numbers automatically appear. And this is where you can have a great use of conditional formatting. Create some kind of variances. If you were to create some kind of a report where you look at old and you look at new, and then do some basic conditional formatting that's simply going to compare the two, this way I don't have to even spend the time looking at my numbers. I can open up the report, refresh the data, look for colors. And if I don't see anything that's, I don't know, bright red or bright yellow or something that jumps out at me, I could say everything's great. Yeah. Now, we've talked a lot about the business aspect of it. We've talked a lot about the processing, but remember, everybody here is using some form of TM1 or planning analytics aspect. So you don't want to forget about the technical implications of all of these things. You want to think about every piece in your model, your data load processes, your dimension builds, your data sources. Maybe they're going to change. If it's a new ERP, you're definitely changing. If you're using it as an opportunity to upgrade your approach, maybe there's a cloud aspect. In the rules, a lot of clients will create those exceptions inside rules and they'll hard code values. If those hard codes have a different meaning or if those hard codes don't exist anymore, you're going to need to go back and change your rules. Security. The way I like to think about security is, do you want to look at every possible combination, or do you want to, and if you saw me, I'd use my fingers right now and do air quotes and say, make it close enough. Okay? We had a client who was doing a 1 to 3 remap. They had to decide upon cell security where we're looking at specific combinations of those 3, or merge them all together, put some kind of a union of the 3 components and make it close enough. Because as you think about it, remember, cell security has a couple, it's great. It's great in the sense that you can look at every individual cell, you can look at definition for every cell, and you can have differing definitions of every cell. But it comes at a cost. It comes at cost number 1 is there's performance implications. Because of the fact that you're looking at every possible cell inside a cube, that could be millions, billions, maybe even trillions of combinations. And there's a bit of a performance impact. Okay? Computers are powerful. Computers are strong. You can absolutely add more processing and add more RAM to it. But you as a human also have to maintain it. And that's where the second implication of cell security comes into play. It's potentially complex to define and to maintain that security. So there are situations where you want to go back and you want to think through and set up security at the cell level based on the new definitions. But there may also be times where you say, let me think a few steps ahead and figure out how hard is it going to be for me to define and more importantly, maintain in the future, and think back on the element side. Okay? You also want to think about the cubes and dimensions, kind of like we talked about before. Do you want to keep your existing cubes or do you want to create new? Or maybe both. Maybe you're going to have situations where you do want to keep your existing. You also want to create new and have them in conjunction. And if you are duplicating that, you want to think about the naming conventions. You want to make sure that you're thinking through, how can I make sure that people know to go to the right spot? Go to the right spot. Views, ad hoc analysis. I need to make sure I'm opening up the cube. Go to the right spot. Predefined reports. I need to make sure that they're pointed to the right cube. Okay. When you're duplicating some of these things, you can also think on the dimension side. What are some of the other pieces that come into play? Maybe I've got hierarchies, whether it's the old definition of consolidations or the new definition of virtual hierarchies. Maybe I've got attributes. You need to take those into consideration, because if you're going to duplicate a dimension and those dimensions need the attributes associated with it, we need to also make sure that they're going to be in the new model, especially if you have rules or logic or some kind of filtering in them. Okay. So what we talked about a little bit earlier is that we do want to make sure that our end users are able to start getting involved with the new chart of account structure as soon as possible. Okay. And I said it before, and I'm going to stress it again in that first bullet point. Do not underestimate the importance of this. Do not underestimate the importance, the need, and the amount of time that it's going to take. Okay. For the project team, get the project team involved as soon as you can. The new chart of account definitions. By having the team participate in the reconciliation process, helps them learn the new chart of account. It also helps to ensure that the data moved from the old chart of account to the new chart of account is correct. Okay? When Revelwood does implementations, We rarely do an implementation where the client says, go build something, we build it, and then we show what was built. In almost every project that we work with, 99.9, maybe even 99.99%, we get the team involved in the development. And that approach of getting the team involved in the development allows them to start understanding the model, understanding their system, and being able to use and maintain it going forward. Getting them involved in the new chart of accounts is the exact same approach. So it's important to get the team involved at the beginning. Okay. When you're getting the team involved, also think about the new cubes. New cubes, new reporting. Early involvement gives these users more time to plan how they want to incorporate this into the reporting. And when you think about the reporting, there's two parts to it. How am I going to use my existing reports? How am I going to change them? What kinds of modifications do I need to make? If I had DBRW formulas, maybe my parameters have changed, or maybe the cube name has changed. Maybe there's an opportunity to create new reports if it turns out we're building a new model or there's some kind of granularity. And there's also new processes, not terminal integrated processes, but business processes. This is potentially going to impact how do you collect the data? Who's going to collect the data? How are they going to be involved? What do they need to know coming in? What new data do they need to have prepared? A lot of different things that come into play. And this is where we could start doing user training. So now we think about how do we train the users? Maybe we do train the trainer sessions. Maybe there's a few people who are very involved from the project team who understand the implication. They understand the chart of accounts. They understand that new business process, and they train everybody else. Maybe we create some kind of documentation, whether it's a PDF, whether it's a Word file, whether it's web-based. What a lot of our clients do, and I'm a big fan of this, is put the instructions directly on the input templates. You know, we've all heard the jokes and we've all heard the comments of men don't read directions. You know, if it wasn't for a GPS, we would never get there. And that's because me as a person, I oftentimes don't read the instructions. I try to figure it out as I go. And in situations where the instructions are directly on that input template, whether it's up in a top section that's in a freeze pane, if it's Excel, or some kind of a box over to the side, if it's on the web, having those instructions there directly is a huge help. It allows not only for people to use it, but it's less questions as people start doing it. Now, the way we think about this is updating your chart of accounts, creating the new ERP, building potentially new models. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, a lot of work, a lot of tasks, a lot of requirements. But there's also a lot of new opportunities. One of the biggest opportunities you can think about is your reports. This is where you can clean up and reanalyze your reports. It's a key task that you have during the change. Okay? Review your existing reports and think about what's truly required. And what we recommend is that you organize your reports into three categories, three buckets. Must have. These are the reports that have to be converted. They need to be available as soon as the new chart of account is active. Your system's going to be a failure if you don't have those reports. Nice to have. These are the kinds of things that can be recreated over time. They're not required to be done by go live. And this is the kind of thing that can be done as people use the system, which also means it can be done by the users because it doesn't have this same time requirement. It doesn't have the same urgency. It gives that an opportunity to learn the new chart of accounts, learn how to build the reports. Okay? But the third bucket is probably the hardest bucket. These are the reports that you can get rid of. Maybe they're redundant to other reports. Maybe there's no significant value, and nobody wants to hear that. Everybody thinks that every report is important. We had one client that told us that originally when we started the project, they had over 1,000 reports that needed to be recreated. They were nervous. Everybody was in a panic. And they said, how are we going to build all these reports? We said, oh, let's pause for a moment. Let's step back. We reviewed them, we optimized, and we merged what they had. And after doing that analysis and after putting them into this bucket, that same 1,000+ reports were brought down to 98. 900+ reports we found that were being produced. They had no business benefits. In one situation, there was a person who was really nervous and said, I create this report. I have to give this report each time. And when we went and talked to the recipient of the report, they said, oh, I didn't even know we were still creating that report. I don't use it. Situations like that give you the opportunity to talk about it, give you the opportunity to think about, are these all necessary? Okay. It's also your opportunity to clean up. We have written some great blogs about this on our Revelwood website, and this is your opportunity to get rid of, kind of like your spring cleaning. This is the opportunity for you to say, let me get rid of some of my TI processes that I'm no longer using. Maybe when I did my implementation a few changes ago, I had some old ODBC, or maybe I had some intro scripts, or maybe I had some processes that start with the word temp. Maybe I had old subsets and views. I have things that have somebody's name in front of it as a public view, or something that start with XX or ZZ or something like that. Okay. Maybe this concept of cleaning it up gives you that ability to do new naming conventions. Long time ago when I first started, I made the foolish mistake of saying, I'm going to save this view as view 1. And then tomorrow I'm going to save it as view 2, and then view 3. And then I come back a week later and say, oh my gosh, what does view 1 mean? This is your opportunity to create some kind of a naming convention. When Revelwood does their implementations, we have a naming convention that we use for views. We have a naming convention for turbo integrator processes, and we purposely use it to use the power of the tool. Alphabetical order, buckets, grouping. We're not in 1980. We don't have 8.3 nomenclature anymore. So it gives us the opportunity to do that kind of a cleanup. Okay. We have the opportunity to think about some new functionality. Okay. This is where new modules can come into play. Anything that's not at the basic GL level, this is your opportunity to plug and play. Maybe I want some new staff planning. Maybe I want some new CapEx, or should I change my revenue approach? Maybe I want to build drill through, whether it's within TM1 or to the new ERP. I may want to drill from the finance model down to the staff details. Maybe I want to go from the finance model back to the journal entries in the ERP. If you had them before, they probably need to be recreated because of new source systems. If you didn't have them before, this is a great opportunity for them to be added. And it's also the opportunity for you to think about your business requirements, my planning process, my requirements. Maybe I want to change the amount of details. We had an insurance client that originally wanted to plan by each individual policy. During the planning process, during the FOT, the implementation, they said, we have to plan. We've always done it in this way. We have to plan for every policy. Well, they did their first budget and they quickly decided, oh my gosh, that was too granular. It's too hard for my end users. I want to change my business process. And they used this opportunity to change the business approach, which gave them faster overall budgeting, less memory used in the TM1 environment, and therefore it was much quicker results when they came out. It's also your opportunity to think about centralization, either make it more centralized or more decentralized. This is your opportunity to have your end users do more of your data entry instead of having a few people do the entry for everyone. It eliminates redundancy. It allows your main finance team to do much more analysis and much less data entry. And this is where during a project, I like to make movie references. For those of you who know me, I reference things all the time. And I love old 80s movies. And there's a great movie called The Shawshank Redemption. And for those of you who've seen it, there is a scene where they are up on the roof. They're tarring the roof. And the main character comes over and he talks about something. And the person, and he says to the person, do you trust your wife? I like to paraphrase that when I'm talking to people during these implementations, and I like to ask the question, do you trust your users? And I usually get some kind of a smile and we have some kind of a discussion about it, but that's really what it comes down to from the centralized or decentralized approach. If you trust your users and you tell your users, you're in charge of this, I need you to focus on making sure that you're putting the right numbers in, it's a great opportunity for you to decentralize. Instead of getting on the phone and having somebody read numbers to you and you just hop on your number keypad and put the numbers in, let them put it in. And that gives you the opportunity to do more analysis of it. Let someone else put the numbers in. And this is also an opportunity to think about that user training. Before we talked a little bit about how can we train, but now we need to think about what do we want to train on. This is a great opportunity to train on some new pieces. Report creation. I've been to clients where they have 1 or 2 people and all they have ended up doing is creating reports for everybody else. We introduced an opportunity to teach people how to do their own ad hoc analysis and their own report creation, and it absolutely made a world of difference. There's an opportunity to learn some of the new tools. Many of you who've been using TM1 for a long time, you know Perspectives. It's a great opportunity to learn PACS. Many of you know TM1 Web. It's a great opportunity to use PAW. Many clients only use Excel. It's a great opportunity to think about the web. There's a lot of great opportunities to learn some of these new tools. And as the users start using it, you're going to see the power. You're going to see some of the drag and drop and the great charts that are in PAW and some of the speed of packs and the virtual hierarchies and pieces like that. It's also an opportunity to think about developer and administrator training. From an administrator training, there are a lot of great new features that are built in. It gives you the opportunity to kind of shift gears a little bit. And this also comes back to the tool. If you think about the old school version of TM1, Excel was your everything. Excel was your reporting tool, your development tool, your administration tool, and the web was designed mostly for reports and inputs. Now, in the new world, it's almost a full 180. The Excel environment is designed for your reports and your inputs, and the web tool is where the development and the administration come into play. This is your opportunity to think about it, and this is your opportunity to learn some of the new pieces. So we've talked a lot in theory, okay? And we've talked about various things to consider on the business side, on the technical side, on the process side. So what I'd like to do now is I want to tell you about some real life examples from some projects that we've worked on. Okay? So one example, we have a company, we worked with a company that made many acquisitions over the year. They grew substantially. And as a result, they decided to recreate the chart of account. Well, what ended up happening is that chart of account restructure took one of their dimensions and they split it up 3 ways. It made 3 new dimensions. And the issue that came into play is that one-to-many remapping. Like we said earlier on in one of the slides, one-to-many remapping is doable, but it can get complex really quickly. So what did we do? We ended up taking the approach where we created 2 TM1 servers. One TM1 server was purposely for the old, one TM1 server was purposely for the new. And that way, we have the ability to use the old server. We have the ability to use everything we know and love, meaning not just TM1, but the existing reports and the existing logins and the existing nomenclature and the existing everything. And then in the new server, we rebuilt all the cubes. We gave it the ability, we gave it new naming conventions. We created new cubes where we had the 3 dimensions instead of the 1. And then what we also did, as you could see through the image at the bottom there, we created a 4th dimension. We created a merged dimension, which was our global input combination. And that merged dimension allowed us to have the 3 separate parts, entity, market, and line of business. And it also allowed us to put the pieces together. Okay? And therefore, when it was time for us to do some of the remapping and the security on the remapping side, within their GL model, all of that was done by the ERP implementation team. So all the data was remapped externally. And what we did is we simply loaded it into TM1. Okay? On the staff model, we kind of split it. The employee information, the data that's going to be used for the future going forward, which particular market was each employee in, which particular entity, which LOB, that was done externally. And when it was time to load our new employee info, we loaded it in. But all the historical compensation data, the ERP team wasn't worried about it. And the ERP team said, I'm not going to remap that for you. We ended up remapping that inside TM1. So that was an example where in the staff model, we used a little bit of both. Whatever the ERP team would give us was wonderful. Anything else we did on our own. And then doing that on our own, we had all the other cubes because there was a series of cubes that were only in TM1, not part of the ERP implementation. Well, because we had those remapping tables from the staff model, we created, populated, used those same remapping for all the other aspects, the projects, the assets, things like that. Okay? And then it came down to security. Because of the fact that there were the 3 different combinations, self-security really, it quickly became really complex. So what we ended up doing is we ended up setting up an element security. We used that where I had the finger quotes and said close enough. And that close enough approach gave us the opportunity to define the security without making it too tight. Okay. We also use this as an opportunity to upgrade TM1. We also use it as an opportunity to convert many of the Excel-based reports into web-based reports, and that made it a lot easier for our end users. Another example, we had a basic chart of accounts restructure. The client was just looking for an easy way to reconcile their existing data into the new chart of account. And the issues that came into play is there were a lot of remappings, a lot of users. Combine the two of those and it made reconciliation really difficult. So what we ended up doing in this particular case is we created and used 3 cubes. Okay? We created 1 cube for the old chart of accounts. We created 1 cube for the new chart of accounts. And then what we did is we created a 3rd cube, which combined the 2 together. Okay? We loaded data into the new chart of accounts. We loaded data into the old chart of accounts, but when we loaded into the old chart of accounts, what we also did is we used a mapping table to load into the combined chart of accounts. Okay? And as we loaded it in, we realized that in some cases a dimension may have existed or it may have not existed, and that's where we figured out where do we put the pieces together. And putting those pieces together, we then built a series of drills. And what that drill allowed us to do is it allowed us to drill from the old into the merged and the new into the merged. And that combination of the various drills made it real easy for us to load the data. We clicked on the button and we had the 3 cubes and the mappings and all that kind of stuff in there. But it also gave us a real easy way to reconcile back and forth so that instead of having to create a few different reports, we could simply look at a number and we could drill back and forth. And by doing that drill, gave us the ability to quickly reconcile without having to do any form of new ad hoc analysis or new kinds of reporting. We had another client that we worked on where they had a new ERP and they wanted to add a new module. In this case, it was a projects module. Okay. Now, while this approach was used as part of a chart of accounts restructure, this can be used at any time for any new modules, not just for a COA. So they had a new module, and the issue was that they wanted to plan and report at a more detailed level. So what we did is we used the existing core finance model to remap, just like we normally would have done. But then what we did is we added a new detailed module. That detailed module had more dimensions to it. It had more granular detail. We created data loads. Those data loads allowed us to create some new imports and exports. We linked the 2 cubes together. We linked the new model into the core model. We also created drill through functionality from that core model back into the new model. It gave the ability for that live circular link. The planning data that I'm putting into the new module automatically flowed into the finance model. Once I was in the finance model, I can then drill backwards and I could see some of the details. And that gave us the opportunity to create new input templates, new reports, a lot more granular detail. Now, all of these situations were examples of something where we absolutely knew what we were doing. Okay? Let's face facts. Let's face reality. Sometimes we don't know what we're doing. And when I say we don't know, we actually don't know what the final game plan is. So we had a situation where there was a merger happening, but it wasn't yet announced to the public. We needed a way to show consolidated results quickly, and also needed to make sure that it wasn't one of the public cubes. We needed to build some kind of a temporary approach, and we needed to make sure that we could take 2 separate charts of accounts and merge it together. So what we ended up doing is we started by analyzing the existing structures. We found that they weren't anywhere close. They had a different number of segments. They had repeated accounts, natural accounts with different meanings. We had virtually everything that we had said earlier on in this deck, don't do. And it's because there hadn't been a cleanup yet. The merger hasn't been official yet. They haven't cleaned up their chart of accounts. As a result, it was 2 completely independent systems. So what we ended up doing is we ended up rebuilding the account dimension. We merged both sets of the existing accounts into a single set of accounts. And what we did is we added a prefix. So if we had 2 situations where we had an account 602, we called one company A, A602, company B, B602. Maybe we had 2 accounts that meant different things. Company A used account 601 as compensation, and company B used account 601 as office supplies. We created a single consistent hierarchy structure. And in situations where there were separate, extra dimensions that were in one cube and weren't in the other, we made sure that there was some kind of a holding element, for example, not applicable or a 000 in this case. And we used that to account for the different number of segments. Okay? Once we created that, we then had the opportunity to generate easy-to-use reports. We could show consolidated reports, show total company. It's going to show all the accounts. And because we had that easy nomenclature, we were able to simply figure out which was from company A, which was from company B. We were also able to create reports by company, which is basic zero suppression. Because we had account A601 and B601, in addition to having a dimension for A and B, When we did zero suppress, it was real easy for us to create a report with company A. All the B's would go away and vice versa. So we just showed 4 examples of situations with real life clients that we help solve. We have many more, and Revelwood is here to help you with this. Revelwood offers an advisory services opportunity where we guide you through this whole process, their business requirements, your system requirements. We help you create a transformation plan, or at a minimum, a roadmap, all infused with the best practices. We've been doing this for a long time. You could see that we have a lot of experience. We have a lot of clients that we've done this for. We'd like to be able to help you with any questions that you have. We encourage you to learn more about Revelwood and our implementation approach by visiting our website at revelwood.com. While you're there, we also encourage you to visit our Knowledge Center. We offer tips and tricks about all aspects of the planning process, technical tips on the tool, planning tips about the budgeting process, and various tips on other business aspects of your FP&A model. Thank you very much for attending today's session. One of my colleagues will be reaching out to you for a 15-minute follow-up call. Hopefully you take the time to share your feedback with us and let us know how else we can help. Thanks again. I hope you have a great rest of your day.